The Haunted Frequency, Episode 1. The Signal That Knows Your Name. 12:07 a.m., the first transmission. The radio hissed. Static crackled through the speakers, filling the dimly lit room with an eerie hum. Martin frowned. The old shortwave receiver on his desk had been picking up strange signals all night. At first, it was nothing but white noise, random bursts of static, occasional garbled voices. But then it spoke. A whisper. Faint. Almost too quiet to hear. But he heard it. And it said his name. 12:15 a.m., the signal keeps calling. Martin leaned in, heart pounding. His fingers trembled as he adjusted the frequency. The whisper returned. Clearer now. Martin, can you hear me? He froze. The voice was his own. A perfect replica. But it couldn't be. The radio wasn't connected to a transmitter. There was no microphone. No way for it to hear him. And yet the voice on the radio was him. 12:30 a.m., the message becomes clear. His breath came in sharp gasps. He reached for his phone, ready to record. The radio crackled again. Martin, don't be afraid. His hand hovered over the power button. A part of him screamed to turn it off, to walk away. But he couldn't. He had to know. Where was the signal coming from? The voice returned. I need you to listen, before it finds you. Static swallowed the transmission. Then silence. 12:45 a.m., the location that shouldn't exist. Martin scrambled to check the frequency. 4.333 megahertz. He typed it into his laptop, searching for any known station broadcasting on that band. Nothing. Then, another sound emerged from the radio. A rhythmic beeping. Morse code. He grabbed a notepad, quickly translating, N34.0522, W118.2437. What the hell? That was a real location. Downtown Los Angeles. But why was a random radio transmission sending him coordinates? And why? Did his own voice warn him to listen? 1 a.m., the first glitch. He needed answers. He copied the coordinates into Google Maps, zooming in. An abandoned building. No records. No history. But as he stared at the satellite image, something made his blood turn cold. The photo had a glitch. A distortion in the center of the rooftop. Like something had been erased. 1:30 a.m., the forgotten station. He dug deeper, searching for archived maps of the location. Finally, an old radio frequency database from 1993 showed a match. 4.333 megahertz, decommissioned signal, wavelength disrupted. The station had existed before. Then it was shut down. But something was still broadcasting. And somehow, it knew his name. 2 a.m., the voice in the dark. Martin felt his apartment shift. Like the air had grown heavier. His laptop screen flickered. His radio, still on, buzzed with a low, distorted hum. Then the voice returned. Martin, it's already inside. His stomach dropped. The radio wasn't connected to the internet. It couldn't respond to him. And yet, it had just answered the question he was thinking. He turned slowly, scanning the room. The shadows looked deeper than before. And then he saw it. A shape standing in the corner. Watching. 2:15 a.m., the static entity. Martin's hands clenched into fists. The figure didn't move. It was featureless, just a silhouette, like a hole punched into reality. But it wasn't silent. A faint crackling noise came from it. Like radio static. He lunged for the radio, twisting the dial frantically. The static grew louder. The figure twitched. The radio buzzed, the frequency shifting on its own. Then the voice returned. Martin, turn it off. 2:30 a.m., the warning comes too late. Martin didn't hesitate. His hand slammed the power button. The radio died. Silence filled the room. He turned back to the corner, but the figure was gone. Had it worked? He exhaled slowly. Then his phone buzzed. Unknown, you shouldn't have done that. Martin's heart stopped. He hadn't told anyone about the transmission. Hadn't messaged anyone. No one else should have known. His hands trembled as he typed back, "Me, who is this?" The reply came instantly. Unknown, the signal doesn't stop just because you turn it off. He felt a chill run down his spine. Unknown, now it knows where to find you. The lights flickered. Then a knock at the door. 3 slow taps. Knock. 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 Martin's breath hitched. He wasn't expecting anyone. The knocking came again. Knock. 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 His phone buzzed one last time. A final message, unknown, do not open it. The Haunted Frequency, Episode 2. Do not answer the transmission. 12:07 a.m. The knocking continues. Knock. 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 Martin stood frozen. The message on his phone burned into his vision. Unknown, do not open it. The knocking came again. Slow. Deliberate. His apartment was on the 3rd floor. No fire escape. No balcony. Who or what was knocking at his door at midnight? His hands clenched into fists. His radio was off. So how was the signal still reaching him? 12:10 a.m., the static behind the door. Martin's breath came in short gasps. The silence pressed against his eardrums. Then KZZZT. A burst of radio static. Not from his radio. From behind the door. His skin crawled. The sound wasn't right. It was alive. Like something was breathing through the static. Then a voice whispered Martin. His stomach twisted into knots. He took a slow step back. Then another. The knocking stopped. Silence. And then his phone buzzed. A new message. Unknown, don't let it in. 12:15 a.m., the frequency returns. Martin forced himself to move. He ripped the curtains closed, shutting out the streetlights. He grabbed his shortwave radio, staring at it like a loaded gun. 4.333 megahertz. The signal that had started this nightmare. With shaking hands, he turned the dial. The radio crackled to life. For a moment, only static. Then a voice. His own voice. Martin. I know you're listening. His heart pounded. The voice continued. You already made contact. It won't stop now. Martin's fingers tightened around the radio. Who are you? He whispered. Silence. Then, the voice returned. Not who. When. 12:30 a.m., the signal from the future. Martin's stomach twisted. What do you mean, when? The voice laughed softly, but it wasn't human. It was warped, like an echo playing in reverse. You've already heard it, Martin. You just don't remember. The static spiked. His own voice spoke again. You need to leave. Before it finds another way in. Martin's throat went dry. Another way in. He turned. And realized his TV was on. But he hadn't turned it on. 12:45 a.m., the broadcast that shouldn't exist. The screen flickered. A grainy, black and white video played. At first, just a room. Familiar. It was his apartment. The footage looked old, like it had been recorded decades ago. But then the door in the video opened. Someone stepped inside. Martin's stomach dropped. It was him. A recording of him. Only, something was wrong. The version of him on the screen moved strangely. Like a puppet on broken strings. It walked toward the radio. And then it turned to the camera. And smiled. 1 a.m., the voice in the TV. The static crackled. The Martin on the screen leaned closer to the camera. His eyes were wrong. Too dark. Too empty. Then he opened his mouth. And Martin heard his own voice echo through the room, "You shouldn't have answered." His TV shut off by itself. Darkness swallowed the room. His radio buzzed again. A final message whispered through the speakers, "It's in the building." And then knock. 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 1:15 a.m., the escape plan. Martin grabbed his backpack. Phone. Keys. Flashlight. He wasn't staying to find out what was knocking this time. He reached for the door handle, then hesitated. What if it was already inside? His radio crackled. Side exit. His pulse hammered. He turned the fire escape. He bolted for the window, yanking it open. The cold air hit his face. He climbed onto the metal landing, then turned back for one last look. His apartment window reflected his face. But then his reflection blinked. And he hadn't. 1:30 a.m., the final transmission. Martin climbed down the fire escape, heart pounding. When his feet hit the pavement, he ran. No plan. No destination. Just away. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A final message. Unknown, this isn't over. The street lights flickered. Somewhere in the distance, a radio hissed to life. A voice whispered through the static, "Martin, can you hear me?" The Haunted Frequency, Episode 3. The voice that follows you. 1:45 a.m., the city doesn't feel right. Martin kept moving. His breath fogged in the cold air as he jogged down the empty sidewalk. The city felt different tonight. Too quiet. Too still. He glanced over his shoulder. Nothing. But the weight of being watched pressed against his back. His phone buzzed. A message from unknown. Don't stop. It's close. His stomach tightened. The street lights buzzed above him, flickering in and out. Then somewhere nearby, a radio clicked on. 2 a.m., the transmission in the street. The sound was faint. A whisper of static floating through the air. Martin slowed, listening. It was coming from a convenience store across the street. The front door was slightly ajar. The radio inside hissed and crackled, playing a warped broadcast. He swallowed hard. Leave. Keep moving. But as he turned to go, a voice crackled through the static. His voice. Martin, come inside. 2:10 a.m., the recording that shouldn't exist. Martin stepped to the door, peering in. The store was empty. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting long, unnatural shadows across the aisles. The radio sat on the counter. Humming. Waiting. He forced himself forward, step by step. The broadcast continued. His voice. You need to listen. The sound was old, degraded, like a tape recording from decades ago. Static swallowed the message. Then a whisper, it's already inside. Martin's blood ran cold. The radio turned off by itself. Then a sound came from the back of the store. Something moved. 2:15 a.m., the figure between the shelves. A can of food rolled across the floor. Martin's breathing slowed. He wasn't alone. Something stood in the aisle, half hidden behind the shelves. A silhouette. It wasn't moving. Just watching. A long, unnatural buzzing noise filled the air. Like radio static trying to form words. Then, it stepped forward. And Martin saw its face. 2:20 a.m., the face that wasn't his. It looked like him. Almost. But its eyes were wrong. Too dark. Too hollow. And when it smiled, Martin saw that its teeth were too sharp. His legs refused to move. The static grew louder. The thing tilted its head. Then, in his own voice, it whispered, you need to run. 2:30 a.m., the chase through the city. Martin bolted. The radio doppelganger lunged forward, too fast for something human. He shoved through the store's front door and ran into the street. The city felt even more wrong now. The air hummed. The street lights flickered in sync, as if something was pulsing beneath reality. His phone buzzed again. Unknown, it's rewriting things. Martin's head pounded. The world around him blurred. Like he was running through a TV broadcast breaking apart. 2:45 a.m., the apartment that shouldn't be there. He turned a corner. And froze. In front of him his apartment building. But that was impossible. He had run blocks away. It shouldn't be here. A faint whisper crackled through the air. Martin, come back inside. The door was slightly open. The radio inside hummed. Waiting. 3 a.m., the final message. Martin clenched his fists. This wasn't real. It was the signal. The frequency. Twisting reality around him. But if he didn't end it, it would never stop. He stepped forward, into the building. The hallway stretched too long. The lights buzzed overhead. The door to his apartment was open. The radio sat on the table, waiting for him. He took a deep breath. Then turned it off. 3:05 a.m., the static goes silent. The radio clicked off. The apartment shuddered. The lights flickered then stabilized. The air felt normal again. Martin let out a breath. He turned to the door. The street outside looked right. Had he won? His phone buzzed. A final message. Unknown, it won't forget you. His stomach sank. Then a sound from behind him. A whisper. Martin, can you hear me? He turned. And the radio was back on. The Haunted Frequency, Episode 4. The Signal That Won't Die. 3:06 a.m., the radio won't turn off. Martin's fingers hovered over the dial. The radio was back on. He had turned it off. He was sure of it. But now, it hummed softly, the static whispering beneath the surface. Then, a voice. His voice. Martin, you're still listening. His stomach turned. He reached for the power button again. But before he could press it, the radio spoke again. Martin, don't look at the window. 3:07 a.m., the figure in the glass. His body tensed. He hadn't planned to look. But now, he couldn't stop himself. Slowly, he turned his head toward the darkened window. Outside, the street was empty. But his reflection wasn't. In the glass, a second figure stood behind him. Tall. Still. Watching. A deep static hum filled the air. And then, the reflection moved. 3:08 a.m., the other Martin spun around. Nothing. His apartment was empty. But the radio still hummed. Then a knock at the door. 3 slow taps. Knock. 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 Martin's chest tightened. The knocking came again. Knock. 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 His phone buzzed. Unknown, do not answer it. The knocking stopped. Silence. Then the radio spoke once more. Martin, let me in. 3:10 a.m., the voice outside the door. His pulse thundered in his ears. The voice had come from the hallway. But it had spoken through his radio. Static crackled. Then a whisper. I can hear you breathing. Martin backed away. He grabbed his phone, his fingers trembling as he typed. Me, who are you? The reply came instantly. Unknown, you already know. Martin swallowed hard. No. No, this wasn't possible. The radio hissed again. And this time, it laughed. 3:15 a.m., the dial that won't stop moving. The radio dial shifted on its own. Slowly. Click. 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 The frequency settled on 4.333 megahertz. Then, the voice returned. His voice. But now, it wasn't whispering. It was screaming. 3:20 a.m., the memory that isn't his. The sound burrowed into his skull. Martin clamped his hands over his ears, but the voice pounded through his mind. It wasn't just noise. It was a memory. A memory he didn't recognize. He was standing in a dark room. A radio sat in front of him. He was not alone. Something stood behind him. Watching. Waiting. Then the voice whispered, "This isn't your life, Martin." And the memory collapsed. 3:30 a.m., the transmission that shouldn't exist. Martin staggered back. His radio was silent again. But he could still hear the whisper. Not from the speakers. From inside his own head. His phone buzzed. Another message. "Unknown, if you stay, it will replace you." Martin's breath hitched. His eyes darted to the window again. His reflection was closer now. Its lips curled into a slow smile. And then it raised a hand. And knocked on the glass. 3:35 a.m., the escape plan. Martin grabbed his keys. He had to get out. He reached for the door handle, but the moment his fingers brushed it, the knob turned from the other side. A single, slow click. The door unlocked. He stumbled back, heart hammering. The radio crackled. "Martin, don't run." 3:40 a.m., the shadow beyond the door creaked open. Martin's breath came in shallow gasps. A shadow spilled into the apartment. Long, unnatural. Something stepped inside. But it wasn't human. Its form wavered, flickering like a glitching signal. Martin couldn't move. The radio hummed louder. The figure took a step forward. And then his phone buzzed again. "Unknown, run." 3:45 a.m., the streets are changing. Martin bolted out the door. He didn't look back. His feet hit the pavement hard as he ran down the street. But something was wrong. The city was changing. The streets didn't match his memory. Buildings were misplaced. Street signs had no names. As if he had stepped into another version of his world. The radio static followed him, whispering in the wind. Then a voice. But this time, it wasn't his. It was deeper. Hollow. "Martin, you're not supposed to be here." 3:50 a.m., the final message. Martin's breath came in sharp gasps. His phone buzzed again. A final message. "Unknown, it's watching. Don't stop." Martin kept running. Street lights flickered violently. The air buzzed with unseen electricity. Then up ahead a figure stood in the middle of the street. Tall. Motionless. Waiting. Martin skidded to a stop. And then, for the first time, the radio spoke in its real voice. A voice that wasn't human. "You can't run forever." The static swallowed the world. And everything went dark. The Haunted Frequency, Episode 5. The signal is in control. 3:51 a.m., the city that isn't his. Martin's lungs burned as he ran. His feet pounded against the pavement, but the street beneath him felt wrong. The buildings weren't where they should be. Storefronts had no names. The street lights hummed with electricity, casting shadows that stretched too far. This wasn't his city anymore. It was something else. And the static in the air told him it was watching. 3:55 a.m., the broadcast takes over. The radio static wasn't just behind him. It was everywhere. From the traffic lights. From the alleyways. From the unseen speakers hidden in the dark. Then, a voice. Deep. Cold. Knowing. "You shouldn't have run, Martin." His stomach twisted. The voice wasn't coming from the radio this time. It was coming from the city itself. 4 a.m., the streets are listening. Martin's phone buzzed violently in his pocket. He grabbed it, his hands trembling. A message from unknown. "Do not answer it." His breath caught in his throat. Answer what? Then, a payphone rang. A single, shrill chime. Then another. Then every payphone on the street rang at once. The sound clawed at his eardrums, echoing in the empty city. His phone buzzed again. Unknown, walk away. But before he could move, the ringing stopped. And the payphone closest to him picked itself up. A slow, mechanical click. And a voice whispered through the receiver, "Martin." 4:05 a.m., the transmission finds him, his knees locked. The voice on the other end shouldn't exist. The payphone receiver hung in midair, as if held by an invisible hand. And then, it spoke again. "Pick up, Martin." His mouth went dry. He took a slow step back. The payphone clicked. Again. "Pick up, Martin." His phone buzzed. "Unknown, run." But before he could move, the voice on the phone changed. It wasn't whispering anymore. It was screaming. 4:07 a.m., the world distorts. Martin's ears rang as the scream tore through the empty street. The city glitched. For a split second the buildings stretched and bent. The pavement rippled like water. And the street lights flickered between decades. Martin stumbled, disoriented. The world was rewriting itself. And he was caught inside it. Then, from the speakers hidden in the dark, the voice returned. "You can't run from a frequency, Martin." 4:10 a.m., the frequency takes control. His legs finally obeyed. He sprinted down the street, weaving between shadows that felt too alive. But every time he turned a corner, he ended up back where he started. The city wasn't letting him leave. The signal was controlling everything. He pulled out his phone, his fingers fumbling to text. "Me, how do I stop it?" The reply came instantly. "Unknown, find the source." Martin's hands shook. The source? His radio. He had to get back to it. But as he turned, a shadow stepped out of an alley. And it was wearing his face. 4:15 a.m., the doppelganger returns. The thing that looked like him tilted its head. Its lips curled into a slow, twisted smile. Then it spoke. "You don't belong here, Martin." The air buzzed with unseen energy. The street lights flickered. Martin took a step back. So did the doppelganger. But not at the same time. A half-second delay. Like a broken reflection trying to catch up. His heart pounded. He needed to move. Now. 4:20 a.m., the final run. Martin turned and sprinted toward his apartment. The doppelganger followed. It didn't run. It just glided forward, as if the world was carrying it toward him. The city blurred around him. The voice whispered from every speaker, every static-filled screen, "You're already too late." 4:25 a.m., the radio speaks on its own. Martin burst through his apartment door. His radio was already on. Static hissed from the speakers. Then a voice. "Martin, you need to listen." His own voice. But from when? The doppelganger stepped into the doorway. And Martin knew he had one last chance. 4:30 a.m., the choice. The static pulsed. The voice repeated itself. "You need to listen." Martin's hands hovered over the radio dials. One move. One chance. If he chose wrong, he would be erased. The doppelganger took another step forward. Martin twisted the dial and spoke the words that could either save him or end everything. "Tell me the frequency." The Haunted Frequency, Episode 6. The frequency that sees you. 4:31 a.m., the choice. The doppelganger stood in the doorway. Martin's fingers trembled over the radio dial. The voice from the static whispered, "Tell me the frequency." His heart pounded. He had one shot. He licked his lips and spoke, 4.333 megahertz. The radio screeched. The doppelganger twitched. And then the world ripped apart. 4:32 a.m., the echo of himself. Martin's vision fractured. He was standing in two places at once. One foot in his apartment. One foot in somewhere else. The static formed words, You should not exist twice. The doppelganger twisted, its face shifting between his own and something hollow. Then it spoke in his voice. Let me back in. Martin staggered back. No. He wasn't letting it take his place. 4:34 a.m., the signal breaks. Martin grabbed the radio dial and turned it hard to the left. The frequency jumped. The static screamed. The apartment walls rippled, as if they weren't solid anymore. The doppelganger's form warped, glitching in and out of existence. It reached for Martin and its fingers passed right through him. Martin's stomach dropped. He wasn't real anymore. 4:35 a.m., the frequency locks him out. His reflection in the window blinked. The wrong way. Then it smiled. Martin's radio crackled. The static spoke one last time. One of you must go. The doppelganger stepped closer. The walls shrank inward. The city outside folded into itself. Martin had seconds left. He grabbed the radio knob and twisted it one last time. 4:36 a.m., the reset. A blinding burst of sound filled the room. Like 1,000 voices overlapping. Like a station searching for a signal that didn't exist. Then silence. Martin gasped for air. He was standing in his apartment. The lights were normal. The radio was off. The world was still. Had he won? He turned toward the window. And saw his own reflection. Just standing there. Watching. And then it whispered, "This isn't over." The Haunted Frequency, Episode 7. The signal is watching. 4:37 a.m., the reflection doesn't blink. Martin stood frozen. His reflection wasn't copying him. It just stared. Unmoving. The room felt too still. His breath fogged against the glass, but the reflection's breath didn't. Then it smiled. 4:38 a.m., the whisper through the glass. Martin's hands trembled. A whisper crawled through the air. From inside the mirror. "You let me in." His stomach twisted. No. He had shut the frequency down. Hadn't he? The reflection tilted its head. "Are you sure you're the real one?" 4:40 a.m., the room that changes. Martin backed away from the mirror. Something felt off. The apartment wasn't quite right. The walls looked deeper. Like the shadows had thickened. The air hummed. A low frequency buzzed beneath reality. Then, his radio clicked on by itself. A soft hissing static. And a voice whispered, "Look at the window." 4:42 a.m., the thing outside. Martin turned slowly. Outside the window, the street wasn't empty anymore. A figure stood under the flickering streetlight. Tall. Still. It had no face. Only shifting static where features should be. Then it started walking toward the building. Martin's chest tightened. His phone buzzed. Unknown, do not let it in. 4:45 a.m., the apartment isn't safe. The static in the air grew thicker. Martin's ears buzzed with invisible pressure. Then his door handle turned. Slowly. He backed away, heart pounding. The radio crackled. The whisper returned. "It's already inside." 4:47 a.m., the wrong shadows. Martin's breath came in short gasps. He turned toward the corner of the room and stopped. There was a shadow standing there. Not moving. Not shaped like his furniture. It had arms. A head. It was watching him. Then it twitched. 4:50 a.m., the signal knows him. Martin bolted for the door. He twisted the knob frantically, but the door wouldn't open. His phone buzzed again. Unknown, the frequency is learning you. His stomach dropped. What does that mean? The radio crackled louder. And then the voice from the static changed. It wasn't whispering anymore. It was laughing. 4:52 a.m., the laugh that isn't human. Martin slammed his hands over his ears. But the sound wasn't coming from the radio anymore. It was coming from everywhere. From the walls. From the ceiling. From inside his own head. His vision blurred. His reflection in the window twisted into something else. Something wrong. Then the laughing stopped. And a voice whispered behind him. "It's your turn now." 4:55 a.m., the final moment Martin spun around. The room was empty. But the static in the air remained. He reached for the radio. Hands shaking. He twisted the dial, searching for another frequency. Anything to break the signal. But the static just laughed softly. Then a new voice spoke. A voice he hadn't heard before. It was his own. But it was coming from the radio. And it said, "Martin, I need you to listen carefully. The Haunted Frequency, Episode 8, the broadcast that knows you." 4:56 a.m., the voice that shouldn't exist. Martin's hands hovered over the radio. The voice on the frequency was his own. "Martin, I need you to listen carefully." His breath hitched. "You need to leave." The static hissed between the words, warping them like an old cassette tape. "Before it's too late." Martin swallowed hard. His throat was dry. "Who are you?" he whispered. The voice on the radio paused. Then, in a lower tone, "I'm you." His skin prickled. Then the voice added, "The one that didn't make it." 4:58 a.m., the other Martin. Martin's heart hammered against his ribs. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The radio static grew deeper, almost pulsing like a heartbeat. Then the voice continued, "This has happened before." Martin shook his head. "No. That was impossible. It's the signal. It rewinds. It loops." The world around him felt suffocating. The air buzzed with electricity. The street outside was wrong. Buildings shifted subtly, as if reality itself was trying to correct an error. "It always ends the same way." Martin's lips parted. "What way?" The voice on the radio whispered, "With you disappearing." 5 a.m., the transmission begins again. The moment the words left the speaker, the city shifted. The static turned into a low hum that vibrated through his bones. Something deep beneath the frequency was waking up. Then a knock at the door. Knock. 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 Martin's body went rigid. His phone buzzed. "Unknown, you have one chance." He stared at the door handle. The knocking came again. Knock. 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 And the radio crackled, "Don't open it." 5:02 a.m., the wrong reality. Martin's hands clenched into fists. The voice on the radio sounded like him, but now, it was breaking apart. Glitches in the words. Fragments skipping like a distorted signal. "Martin, can you? You have to." The static drowned the message. Then the knocking stopped. Silence. And then, from the other side of the door, a voice spoke. His own voice. "Martin, let me in." 5:04 a.m., the shadow in the room. Martin stepped back. The air in the apartment felt heavy, like the room itself was pressing inward. He turned toward the window. And his reflection wasn't there. Instead, the glass showed a darkened version of the apartment. Like a copy that was a second too slow. Then a shadow moved in the reflection. Something was standing behind him. 5:06 a.m., the static grows louder. Martin spun around. Nothing. But the radio buzzed violently. The voice was back. "You have to end the signal." Martin's hands trembled. "How?" he whispered. The radio crackled. Then, for the first time, the static spoke as something else. A voice that wasn't his. "You have to leave it behind." His stomach sank. "Leave what behind?" A pause. "Then yourself." 5:10 a.m., the last message. Martin felt like he couldn't breathe. The static screamed in his ears. The city outside his window flickered, as if it were barely holding together. Then a final message appeared on his phone. "Unknown, step through." His pulse thundered. The mirror. It wasn't just reflecting anymore. It was opening. And something on the other side was waiting for him. 5:12 a.m., the choice he can't take back. Martin took a slow step forward. The surface of the mirror rippled. His reflection was there now. But it wasn't copying him. It was smiling. Martin reached out. His fingers brushed The Haunted Frequency, Episode 9. The Reflection That Isn't You. 5:13 a.m., the world behind the glass. Martin's body was weightless. The moment his fingers touched the surface of the mirror, the glass swallowed him whole. For a split second, he felt like he was falling. Then his feet hit solid ground. And he was somewhere else. The air was thick with static. The world around him looked like his apartment, but it wasn't. The walls breathed. The furniture shifted when he wasn't looking. And worst of all, he wasn't alone. 5:15 a.m., the other Martin A figure stood in the corner of the room. Its back was turned. Still. Unmoving. But Martin knew exactly who it was. Himself. The copy. The reflection. The thing that had been watching him from the other side. It slowly turned its head. Its face was wrong. Like a blurred photograph. Like a transmission just slightly out of sync. Then it whispered, "You don't belong here." 5:17 a.m., the distortion. The apartment shook. Martin stumbled backward, his heart pounding. The static in the air grew thicker. The walls rippled, like the signal was trying to correct itself. His reflection, his copy, tilted its head. "You're breaking the signal." Its voice was warped, glitching in and out. Martin's throat was dry. "What is this place?" The thing smiled. "It's what's left when the broadcast ends." 5:20 a.m., the radio tower. Martin turned toward the window. And froze. There was no city outside. Only blackness. An endless void, stretching beyond anything he could comprehend. But in the distance a tower loomed. Tall. Silent. Pulsing with an unseen signal. Martin's hands clenched into fists. "That's the source, isn't it?" The copy nodded. "It's where all of this begins." 5:23 a.m., the door that shouldn't be there. A low hum filled the room. The air shimmered, and suddenly a door appeared. Martin hadn't seen it before. Had it been there all along? The copy stepped forward, tilting its head. "You have a choice." Martin swallowed. "What choice?" The copy's face glitched, its features shifting between familiar and something else. "Go to the tower, or let the signal take you." A heavy silence filled the room. Then the radio clicked on. A voice whispered through the static, "Martin, don't listen to him." 5:25 a.m., the third voice. Martin's chest tightened. The radio shouldn't be on. And that voice, it wasn't his. It wasn't the copy's either. It was something else. The air thickened. Then, from the shadows of the room, another figure stepped forward. Not a copy. Not a reflection. Something wrong. The copy tensed. "You shouldn't be here." The figure laughed softly. The sound sent chills down Martin's spine. "Neither should you." 5:28 a.m., the thing without a face. The new figure had no face. Just static where features should be. It took a slow step forward, the shadows clinging to its form. Martin's breath hitched. The copy stepped in front of him. "Run." The thing in the shadows tilted its head. Then it moved. Too fast. Too unnatural. The world glitched. And Martin ran. 5:30 a.m., the streets of the broadcast. The door led him outside. But it wasn't his city. It was a copy. Like an old VHS tape of his world, playing on a loop. Buildings flickered in and out of existence. Street lights hummed with an unseen energy. And in the distance the tower pulsed. Martin didn't stop. He ran toward it. toward the source of the frequency. 5:33 a.m., the final transmission begins. His phone buzzed. He grabbed it without stopping. A message from unknown. "You're almost there." Martin's pulse thundered. Almost where? Then, ahead of him the tower shifted. It wasn't a tower anymore. It was a radio station. And inside, the broadcast was still running. 5:36 a.m., the station at the end of reality. The doors to the station swung open as Martin approached. Inside, rows of old equipment buzzed with static. Monitors flickered with distorted images of his life. The moment he turned on the radio, the moment he heard his own voice, and at the center of it all a microphone, waiting for him. 5:38 a.m., the final choice. Martin stepped forward. A chair sat before the microphone. His chair. As if he had been here before. A screen flickered. A countdown appeared. 2 minutes. He had 2 minutes. His phone buzzed again. A final message from unknown. "You know what to do." Martin's eyes flicked to the microphone. The only way to end it? The only way to break the loop. He had to broadcast something new. Something that would override the frequency. Something that would finally set him free. He took a deep breath and spoke. The Haunted Frequency, Episode 10, the broadcast that ends everything. 5:39 a.m., the transmission room. Martin stood before the microphone. The countdown on the monitor ticked down. 1 minute and 59 seconds. The air inside the radio station was thick with static. The screens flickered endless images of himself. Every moment that had led him here. The voice on the radio had said he needed to speak something new. Something that could override the signal. But what? His hands trembled. He had to choose. 5:40 a.m., the other frequencies. The static around him shifted. The walls flickered, as if they were barely holding together. The microphone crackled to life. A voice whispered from the speakers, "Martin, don't do this." His stomach twisted. It was himself. But not from the radio. From behind him. He turned. And saw his copy. 5:41 a.m., the final warning. The copy stood in the doorway. It didn't look quite human anymore. Its body glitched, shifting between solid and transparent. "If you speak," it whispered, "you will erase everything." Martin's breath came in short gasps. The countdown continued. 1 minute and 30 seconds. The static pulsed. The walls shook. His phone buzzed. A message from unknown. "Ignore it. Keep going." His throat was dry. What was the right choice? 5:42 a.m., the other Martins. The copy took a slow step forward. Then another. The light overhead buzzed, casting long, unnatural shadows. And then the door behind it opened. Martin's stomach dropped. Because standing in the doorway were more of them. Dozens of Martins. All watching him. All whispering in unison. "Don't speak." 5:43 a.m., the signal pushes back. The frequency fought back. The entire station shuddered. The microphone hissed, desperate for a voice. The screens showed glitches of time, images of him turning on the radio for the first time. Images of him running through the city. Images of him disappearing. This had happened before. And it would happen again. Unless he ended it? Now. 45 seconds. 5:44 a.m., the choice he can't take back. Martin stepped toward the microphone. The other Martins screamed in protest. The static became deafening. The countdown hit 30 seconds. His phone buzzed one last time. "Unknown, speak." Martin took a deep breath. And spoke into the microphone. "This frequency ends now." 5:45 a.m., the signal collapses. The moment the words left his lips, the radio station exploded in static. The walls tore apart. The other Martins faded, their voices warping into nothingness. The frequency screamed. Reality fractured. The tower outside collapsed in on itself. And then silence. 5:46 a.m., the world reset. Martin opened his eyes. He was back in his apartment. The radio sat on the table. Off. No static. No whispers. The city outside was normal. Had it worked? He reached for his phone. No messages. No unknown. Nothing. For the first time in days. There was only silence. 5:47 a.m., the final message. Martin exhaled. It was over. He picked up the radio, ready to throw it away forever. But then his phone buzzed. A single notification appeared on the screen. A message from unknown. Just 2 words. Look behind. His stomach dropped. Slowly, he turned toward the mirror. His reflection was there. But it wasn't moving. Then it smiled. The Haunted Frequency, Episode 11. The Echo That Remains. 5:48 a.m., the smile in the mirror. Martin's breath caught in his throat. His reflection shouldn't be smiling. His own face, but slightly off. The expression wasn't his. The apartment felt too quiet. The radio was off. The city outside looked normal. But deep in his gut, Martin knew something was still wrong. His phone buzzed. A message from unknown. It's not over. 5:50 a.m., the echo begins. Martin backed away from the mirror. His reflection didn't move. Then a whisper. From the glass. I remember everything. His stomach twisted. No. No, that wasn't possible. The frequency was gone. The broadcast was shut down. Hadn't he won? The reflection's smile widened. You think you erased it? Martin's chest tightened. He turned and the radio turned on by itself. 5:52 a.m., the static returns. Martin's pulse pounded in his ears. The radio let out a low, humming static. Not the same violent screeching as before. But something deeper. Something alive. The voice whispered again, it never leaves, Martin. His hands clenched into fists. What are you? The mirror rippled, like a pond disturbed by a single drop. The reflection stepped forward. Not Martin. Not anymore. 5:54 a.m., the other Martin. The figure in the mirror moved first. Martin froze. His reflection wasn't just delayed, it was independent. The glass shimmered as it took another step forward. Then another. The mirror was no longer a boundary. It was a door. And the thing inside was coming through. Martin bolted for the door. But his phone buzzed. A new message. Unknown, don't turn your back. 5:55 a.m., the stair that holds him. Martin stopped. His breath hitched. The figure in the mirror stared at him. Something deep inside him screamed, don't look away. Because if he did, would it switch places with him? The mirror warped, stretching reality around it. The walls vibrated with an invisible force. And then the copy laughed. 5:57 a.m., the city changes. A deep, droning hum filled the air. The reflection whispered, you thought you left the signal behind. Martin's chest ached. Something buzzed outside. He turned toward the window. And the city was different. The buildings were the same. The streets were still there. But the colors were muted. The sky was too dark. Like a version of the city that had never been lived in. Martin was still inside the frequency. 5:59 a.m., the final message. His phone buzzed one last time. A single message. Unknown, one of you has to go. Martin turned back to the mirror. The other him was right there. Face to face. So close he could feel its breath. The walls vibrated harder. The city outside flickered. The frequency was resetting itself. And this time only one Martin would remain. Martin lunged. The Haunted Frequency, Episode 12. The Battle for Reality. 6 a.m., the final standoff. Martin lunged. His fingers barely grazed the glass before the reflection moved first. It grabbed his wrist too strong. Too cold. Martin's breath caught in his throat. The walls of his apartment warped. The city outside glitched, flickering between real and something else. The reflection's grip tightened. And then it whispered, "You don't belong here." 6:01 a.m., the frequency takes hold. A surge of static electricity crackled through Martin's veins. The room pulsed. The mirror was no longer glass. It was liquid. A shifting, rippling portal between two realities. Martin struggled, but his reflection was stronger. The air buzzed with an unseen force. The frequency was choosing. One of them had to go. 6:03 a.m., the city rejects him. Martin's knees buckled. The reflection pushed him backward away from the real world. He crashed onto the floor, the room twisting around him. The city outside darkened. The streets no longer looked familiar. Buildings bent at impossible angles. The sky was empty. No stars. No moon. No light. He had been cast out. And the reflection? It stepped forward, into his world. Taking his place. 6:05 a.m., the new Martin. The reflection looked down at him. Its eyes hollow. Empty. Wrong. But then, it blinked. And suddenly it looked just like him. Perfectly human. Indistinguishable. The reflection was no longer a copy. It was Martin. And Martin was nothing. 6:07 a.m., trapped in the broadcast. Martin staggered to his feet. The air around him buzzed with static. The apartment behind the mirror was gone. Now, he stood in an endless city, silent. Unfinished. Like a forgotten signal left running forever. The reflection had stolen his life. And he was trapped inside the frequency. 6:10 a.m., the radio station beyond time. In the distance, Martin saw it, the radio tower. A monolithic, glowing beacon in the darkness. If there was a way out, it was there. Martin ran. The world shifted around him, as if the city itself was watching. The frequency wasn't done with him yet. 6:15 a.m., the broadcast never stops. The entrance to the station stood open. Inside, old equipment hummed, alive with distorted energy. The screens showed static-filled images of his life. Every step he had taken. Every choice he had made. Then a chair sat before a microphone. The same one he had used before. A voice crackled through the speakers, "Sit down, Martin." 6:18 a.m., the system reset. Martin hesitated. But deep inside, he knew. The frequency had a rule. One Martin in, one Martin out. The only way to return was to override the signal. He sat. The microphone hummed to life. A countdown appeared on the screen. 30 seconds. His hands clenched into fists. The copy had stolen his world. But he had one last move left. Martin took a deep breath. And spoke. 6:19 a.m., the final transmission. "This is Martin." His voice echoed through the station. The screens flickered wildly. "This is my frequency." A deep hum vibrated through the air. "And I am taking it back." The countdown hit 0. The world shattered. And Martin woke up. 6:20 a.m., back to reality. Martin sat bolt upright. His apartment was silent. The radio was off. The city outside was normal. Had it worked? Then, in the mirror he saw himself. No delay. No flicker. Just him. And for the first time, he dared to believe. Maybe he was finally free. 6:21 a.m., the last message. His phone buzzed. A single notification appeared on the screen. A message from unknown. Just 2 words. Are you? Martin's stomach dropped. He turned toward the mirror. His reflection was still there. And then it winked. Haunted Frequency, Episode 13. The reflection that watches. 6:22 a.m., the wink. Martin's breath hitched. His reflection had just winked at him. His own face, moving independently. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then the reflection whispered, "You think you're the real one?" Martin stumbled back. The radio in the corner let out a soft hiss of static. His phone buzzed. Unknown, do not trust it? 6:24 a.m., the subtle changes. Martin forced himself to breathe. Everything looked normal. The apartment. The city outside. Even his own body felt real. But something felt wrong. The air was too still. And when he looked down, his hands weren't shaking. His hands always shook after what he had been through. But now, steady. Too steady. 6:26 a.m., the reflection nose. The mirror rippled. His reflection leaned forward, resting its hands against the glass. Martin stayed frozen. Then the reflection mouthed something. No sound. Just lips moving. He couldn't understand. His stomach tightened. Then, the reflection smirked and said it again. Look at your shadow. 6:28 a.m., the shadow test. Martin's skin crawled. Slowly, he turned toward the wall. His shadow stretched out, cast long and dark by the morning light. At first, it looked normal. Then it moved. Not with him. It twitched first. A half-second too soon. Like it was predicting his movement. His chest tightened. No, that's not. Then his shadow tilted its head. And smiled. 6:30 a.m., the switch. Martin backed away from the wall. His shadow followed, but not perfectly. It was out of sync. His hands clenched into fists. What did you do to me? He whispered. His reflection laughed softly. I didn't do anything, Martin. The mirror shimmered. You did this to yourself. The words sent a deep, sickening dread through his stomach. No, the reflection's grin widened. You were so eager to get back. Martin's head spun. Memories of the final transmission. The microphone. The frequency collapsing. Had he made a mistake? 6:32 a.m., the city glitches. His phone buzzed again. Unknown, check the city. Martin turned toward the window. Outside, the city stretched before him. People walked the streets. Cars moved through intersections. It looked real. It looked normal. But then a man on the sidewalk stopped walking. Then another. Then another. All at once. Perfectly synchronized. Then they all looked up at his window. 6:34 a.m., the watchers. Martin's blood ran cold. The people on the street didn't just look at him. They stared. Unblinking. Then one by one, they began to smile. His phone buzzed violently in his hand. Unknown, run. Martin's breath caught. Then the lights in his apartment flickered. 6:36 a.m., the realization. His shadow twitched again. His reflection's grin widened. Martin grabbed the nearest object, a lamp, and hurled it at the mirror. The glass shattered. But the reflection was still there. Standing. Smiling. No mirror. No barrier. Just him. Then it whispered, you're in my world now. 6:38 a.m., the choice. Martin ran for the door. The city outside was warping. Buildings tilted. The sky darkened. This wasn't reality. Not the one he remembered. Had the signal copied him instead? Was he still inside the frequency? Or worse, had the frequency become his reality? His phone buzzed one last time. A final message. Unknown, you have to break it. Martin's breath hitched. Break what? And then the world flickered. The Haunted Frequency, Episode 14. The reality that isn't yours. 6:39 a.m., the flicker. The world flickered. For a split second, Martin saw two versions of his apartment. One real. One wrong. His breath came in sharp gasps. The reflection was gone. But its voice whispered from behind him, "You're still in the signal." 6:41 a.m., the city is not real. Martin stumbled to the window. Outside, the city looked normal, at first. Then, in the distance, a building blinked out of existence. For half a second, only static remained in its place. Then it reappeared slightly, different. Martin's stomach turned. The city was glitching. And if the city wasn't real, was he? 6:43 a.m., the changes begin. Martin turned back to his apartment. The walls breathed. The shadows twisted. Something was rewriting him. He grabbed his phone. A message from unknown. "The signal is trying to replace you." Martin's fingers trembled as he typed. "Me, how do I stop it?" The reply came instantly. "Unknown, find the source." 6:45 a.m., the radio won't die. Martin turned toward the radio. It sat in the corner, silent. But when he stepped closer, it clicked on by itself. A slow hum filled the air. Then, a voice. Martin, not his reflection's voice. Not the signal's. But his own. From the radio. And it whispered, "It's too late." 6:47 a.m., the countdown begins. The radio buzzed violently. The screen flickered. A countdown appeared. 10 minutes. Martin's pulse spiked. He had 10 minutes before. Before what? He turned back to the window. The sky was glitching. The clouds rewound like a corrupted VHS tape. The signal was resetting. And if it reset, would Martin still exist? 6:49 a.m., the door that shouldn't be there. A door appeared in the middle of his apartment. It hadn't been there before. It led nowhere. Or, it led to the source. The radio crackled again. His voice, his real voice, whispered, "You don't have much time." Martin clenched his fists. Then he reached for the doorknob and stepped through. 6:51 a.m., the place between signals. Darkness swallowed him. For a moment, there was nothing. Then a dim, humming glow. Martin stood in an endless void. And at the center of it, a radio tower. The source. Martin took a slow step forward. The hum in the air grew louder. Then a voice whispered, "Martin, you shouldn't be here." 6:53 a.m., the broadcaster. A figure stepped out of the shadows. Not his reflection. Not a glitch. But something else. Tall. Faceless. And wearing a headset. The entity studied him. Then it spoke, its voice layered with static. "You are disrupting the signal." 6:55 a.m., the final choice. Martin's phone buzzed. A single message from unknown. "You have to shut it down." His pulse pounded. The radio tower hummed louder. The broadcaster stepped closer. "If you break the frequency, you break yourself." Martin stared at the control panel in front of him. Wires pulsed with energy. He had 5 minutes. His hands hovered over the switch. Was this real? Was he? He had to choose. Now. The Haunted Frequency, Episode 15. The signal must end. 6:56 a.m., the countdown continues. Martin's hands hovered over the switch. 4 minutes remaining. The radio tower pulsed, an unseen force radiating from its metallic frame. The broadcaster took another step forward. Its faceless head tilted slightly, as if studying him. "You can still walk away." Martin's breath came fast and shallow. "And if I don't?" The broadcaster's voice layered over itself, a distorted chorus of whispers. "Then you will become part of the signal." 6:57 a.m., the city begins to unravel. Martin's phone buzzed violently. A single message from unknown. It's now or never. He turned back toward the control panel. The buttons flickered, displaying frequencies he didn't recognize. The city behind him warped, buildings stretching like melted wax. In the distance, the sky fractured, revealing a void beyond. The world was coming undone. He had to act now. 6:58 a.m., the final transmission. The broadcaster extended a hand. You don't have to fight. Martin's fingers trembled over the switch. He could hear whispers from the static. Thousands of voices. Trapped. Lost inside the signal. His heart pounded. 2 minutes and 30 seconds. The broadcaster stepped closer. You were never real to begin with. Martin's grip tightened. Then let's see what happens when I pull this. And he flipped the switch. 6:59 a.m., the signal screams. A violent burst of static exploded from the tower. Martin was thrown backward, his vision fracturing as reality split apart. The broadcaster's form shattered, breaking into fragments of distorted images. Faces. Memories. Echoes of those who had been trapped before him. The sky ripped open, revealing endless streams of glitching figures. The frequency was collapsing. 7 a.m., the reset. Martin's body fell through darkness. The last thing he heard was the broadcaster's final whisper, you can't erase what's already begun. Then silence. A deep, endless void. For a moment, Martin thought he was gone. Then a breath. A heartbeat. His eyes snapped open. 7:01 a.m., back to reality. Martin sat up gasping. His apartment. His city. The radio sat silent on the table. No static. No hum. The world outside the window looked normal. Had he done it? His phone buzzed. A single message from unknown. It's over. Martin let out a shaky laugh. For the first time in days he believed it. 7:02 a.m., the final message. As he stood, stretching his sore limbs, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the window. He looked tired. Worn down. But alive. Then his reflection smiled. Martin's breath hitched. His lips hadn't moved. The smile wasn't his. His phone buzzed one last time. A single word appeared on the screen. Run. The Haunted Frequency, Episode 16. The Reflection That Won't Leave. 7:03 a.m., the warning. Martin's heart pounded. His reflection was smiling. But he wasn't. His phone buzzed again. Unknown, you need to move. Now. The air in the apartment felt heavier, like the walls were pressing in. The radio, silent for the past few minutes, clicked on. A low, humming static filled the room. Then, a whisper from the speaker, you took something that wasn't yours. 7:05 a.m., the other Martin. The mirror rippled. The reflection didn't just smile anymore. It moved. A single, slow step forward. Martin's throat went dry. The mirror was supposed to be solid. But now it was a door. And something was stepping through. 7:07 a.m., the escape plan. Martin stumbled back. His phone buzzed furiously. Unknown, you need to get out. It's trying to replace you. His stomach twisted. Again. Hadn't he already escaped the signal? He grabbed his keys and turned toward the door. But the lock wouldn't turn. The walls flickered. And then the reflection spoke. You're in my place now. 7:09 a.m., the wrong reality. Martin's breathing came fast and shallow. The air was shifting. The apartment wasn't quite the same anymore. Small changes. The rug had the wrong pattern. The picture frame on the wall held a photo he didn't remember taking. And outside the window the city wasn't moving. People stood completely still on the streets below. As if frozen in place. As if waiting. 7:11 a.m., The mirror whirled, the reflection stepped out fully. It looked exactly like him. Same face. Same eyes. Same clothes. But something felt off. It was too smooth. Too perfect. Like an imitation trying too hard. Then it grinned. I've been waiting a long time for this. 7:13 a.m., the fight for control. Martin lunged at the thing. His fists connected, but it was like hitting water. The reflection bent and shifted, absorbing the impact. Then, faster than he could react, it mimicked his attack perfectly. A fist slammed into Martin's ribs. He hit the floor, gasping for air. Above him, the reflection towered over him. You don't belong here anymore. 7:15 a.m., the door opens, the radio buzzed louder. A deep, vibrating hum filled the air. The walls warped, stretching like liquid. Martin's phone flashed with another message. Unknown, you still have a way out. Take it. A door appeared. Not the apartment door. A new one. A door that led somewhere else. But before he could move, the reflection grabbed his wrist. You can't leave. Martin fought back. But the reflection's grip wasn't just strong. It was becoming him. 7:17 a.m., the final struggle. Martin's vision blurred. His thoughts felt heavy. Like something was invading his mind. The reflection was absorbing him. Becoming him. The world glitched, colors shifting between bright and dark. Then a surge of instinct kicked in. Martin drove his elbow into the reflection's face. It staggered back, flickering like a broken screen. Martin sprinted toward the new door. 7:19 a.m., the decision. The reflection screamed in rage. The walls buckled. Martin reached the door and hesitated. If he stepped through, where would he end up? His phone buzzed. Unknown, it's your only chance. Behind him, the reflection regained its form. Martin clenched his jaw and jumped through the door. 7:20 a.m., the unknown space darkness. Martin fell through nothingness. The reflection's scream echoed behind him. Then a bright white light ahead. He reached for it. The hum of static grew louder. And then everything went silent. Martin opened his eyes. And realized. He wasn't in his apartment anymore. The Haunted Frequency, Episode 17. The space between signals. 7:21 a.m., the void. Martin fell through nothingness. There was no sky. No ground. Only static. A humming white abyss stretching infinitely in every direction. His body felt weightless, drifting through an empty void between realities. His breath was the only sound until the whispers began. Soft. Echoing. Every voice was his own. You shouldn't be here. 7:23 a.m., the fractured versions. The static around him shifted. Images flickered like broken TV signals. Different versions of himself. One Martin trapped in the mirror, pounding to get out. Another running endlessly through a dark city that never ended. Another sitting before a microphone, speaking words that warped into static. These weren't just echoes. They were real. Martin wasn't the only one. He was just the only one who had made it this far. 7:25 a.m., the entity waits. A new shape formed in the static. Not a reflection. Not a copy. Something else. It had no face, just a shifting mass of distorted signals. The hum in the air deepened as it spoke. You broke the loop. Martin's fingers clenched into fists. I escaped. The entity laughed. A hollow, empty sound. Did you? 7:27 a.m., the choices presented. The void rippled. The images of the other Martins blurred. Some were erased instantly. Others froze in place, like a paused recording. The entity spoke again. You have two choices. Martin's pulse pounded. Go back. The void shimmered, revealing a doorway. His apartment. The world he knew. Or take my place. Martin's stomach dropped. Beyond the entity, another shape materialized, a tower. A seat before a microphone. The center of the signal. The source. The one who controlled the broadcast. The one who kept the loop running. The broadcaster was gone. And now, someone had to take its place. 7:29 a.m., the price of escape. Martin's breath hitched. If I take your place, the entity tilted its head. The frequency needs a voice. Martin's hands clenched. And if I refuse? The entity didn't answer. Instead, the doorway back to his world began to close. Martin turned. His apartment flickered, like an old VHS tape degrading. If he hesitated, he'd lose his only way out. 7:31 a.m., the final decision. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Unknown, if you return, the signal will find you again. Martin's stomach twisted. There was no true escape. Either he left, knowing the signal would always try to reclaim him. Or he took control. Became the one who decided what the signal would be. The hum in the air deepened. The entity stepped back. Waiting. Martin took one step toward the open doorway. Then stopped. He glanced at the tower. At the microphone waiting in the darkness. Then he made his choice. To be continued. The Haunted Frequency, Episode 18. The voice that must choose. 7:32 a.m., the choice before him. Martin stood frozen. The door back to his world flickered, a fragile reality waiting for him. But behind him the tower pulsed, waiting for a new broadcaster. The entity's voice echoed through the void. Decide, Martin. The static buzzed in his skull. His fingers trembled. Could he really return? Or had he gone too far? 7:34 a.m., the truth about the signal. The static around him shifted, revealing flickering images of the past. Not just his past, but the past of others before him. Faces blurred in distortion. Men and women trapped in the signal. Voices that had once been real. Martin's stomach twisted. The signal didn't create echoes. It absorbed them. It was feeding on them. And now it wanted him too. 7:36 a.m., the entity's offer. The entity loomed closer, its form twisting in and out of existence. You already know the answer. Martin clenched his fists. Why me? The entity's static-laced voice rippled through the void. Because you listened. The radio. The first night. He had turned the frequency on. And the moment he did, the signal chose him. 7:38 a.m., the escape window closes. The door leading back to his world shuddered. The image of his apartment warped, becoming unstable. His phone buzzed. Unknown, this is your last chance. Martin's heart pounded. If he didn't leave now, he never would. But if he returned, would he ever be truly free? The frequency would still exist. It would always be watching. Always waiting. 7:40 a.m., the broadcaster's seat. Martin turned toward the tower. The seat sat empty. A microphone waited, its signal stretching across infinite realities. The entity stepped back. You can make it yours. Martin's breath hitched. If he took control, could he change the signal? Could he end it for good? Or would he simply become another voice, trapped forever? The static grew louder. The weight of his choice pressed down on him. 7:42 a.m., the unknown message. His phone buzzed one last time. But this time it wasn't unknown. It was his own number. The message, don't trust the tower. Martin's blood ran cold. What the hell? Was this him from another loop? Another Martin trying to warn him? His fingers hovered over the screen. But it was too late. The door behind him vanished. His choice had been made. 7:44 a.m., the moment of acceptance. The entity stepped aside. Martin approached the tower's entrance, the air buzzing around him. Inside, The control panel glowed with unseen energy. He sat. The microphone pulsed before him. His own voice echoed from the speakers, "This is Martin. I am the signal now." The world shook. Reality rewrote itself. And everything went dark. 7:46 a.m., the new signal begins. Martin opened his eyes. He was still in his apartment. The radio sat before him. Silent. The city outside looked normal. Was it over? Then his phone buzzed. A single message. From unknown. "Welcome back, broadcaster." Martin's heart stopped. Then, from the radio, a whisper. His own voice. "The transmission is yours now." A Haunted Frequency, Episode 20, Final Episode, the broadcast that ends everything. 8:08 a.m., the loop tightens. Martin's breath came in ragged gasps. He was back in front of his apartment. The transmission had rewound time, resetting everything as if he had never left. But now something was watching him. A shadow stood at the end of the hallway. Tall. Unmoving. Then, it spoke. "You can't leave." 8:10 a.m., the signal's true form. The static in the air deepened, vibrating through his skull. The entity stepped forward from the darkness. It wasn't a person. Not anymore. A shifting mass of frequencies, flickering between human shapes. Every version of himself that had been trapped before. It whispered, "You are part of the transmission." 8:12 a.m., the final choice. Martin's phone buzzed. A message from unknown. "The source is still open. Move now." His stomach twisted. The source, the core of the frequency. The only way to end this. But the entity blocked his path. The walls shimmered, glitching in and out of existence. Martin had seconds to act. 8:14 a.m., the run to the source. Martin bolted. The entity lunged after him, its form stretching like liquid. The city outside warped, buildings twisting like melted wax. The frozen people moved in unison, their heads turning to stare at him. The radio tower pulsed in the distance. The heart of the transmission. If he could get there, he could end it. 8:16 a.m., the city collapses. The streets beneath his feet fractured, breaking apart. Every step felt unstable, like running across thin ice. The static grew deafening. His own voice echoed through the air, "This isn't real." He wasn't just inside the signal. The signal was consuming reality itself. He had to shut it down. 8:18 a.m., the tower doors opened. The doors to the radio tower swung open as he approached. Inside, a massive control panel, humming with unstable energy. Screens flashed images of his past. Every moment he had ever existed. Every decision that had led him here. The microphone at the center buzzed, waiting for him. The final broadcast. 8:20 a.m., the final transmission. Martin grabbed the microphone. His reflection flickered in the glass screen. His own face staring back at him, but not as he remembered it. Distorted. Fading. He had seconds left. His phone buzzed one last time. "Unknown, say the words." Martin took a deep breath and spoke into the microphone. "The transmission ends now." 8:21 a.m., the signal breaks. A massive shockwave erupted from the tower. The world fractured, breaking apart like shattered glass. The entity screamed, its form dissolving into raw static. The city unraveled, piece by piece. Then silence. A deep, endless void. For a moment, Martin thought he was gone. Then he woke up. 8:22 a.m., back to reality. Martin sat up, gasping. His apartment. His city. The radio sat silent on the table. No static. No hum. The world outside the window looked normal. Had he done it? His phone buzzed. A single message from unknown. "It's over." Martin let out a shaky laugh. For the first time in days he believed it. 8:23 a.m., the final message. As he stood, stretching his sore limbs, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the window. He looked tired, worn down, but alive. Then his reflection smiled. Martin's breath hitched. His lips hadn't moved. The smile wasn't his. His phone buzzed one last time. A single word appeared on the screen. Run.